Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Mark Isix.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How are you, Nick?
On semi-summer vacation. Yourself?
Very nice. A little less than semi summer vacation, a quarter summer vacation, I guess. But it's really nice nonetheless. It's we just had our graduation ceremony yesterday, and it was beautiful, and the kids were very happy, and the parents were very happy, and it couldn't have gone any better. And it was a wonderful graduating class, and we'll be very sad to see them go, but looking forward to hearing great things and hearing about all their accomplishments as they move forward. And really a wonderful group of kids, and really happy for them and their parents.
Well, that's great. I think graduations are all probably over by now, and kids are in summer mode, and teachers are in refresh mode.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. And teachers are already out and about, gone off to all points around the globe, and in some cases just to the beach, like myself. But I know a lot of people doing a lot of traveling and recharging their batteries, which is really, really important. And a lot of people, when they criticize teachers, they talk about the time off. But when you work very closely and intensely with children for a very long period of time, you really do need to recharge your battery. I could just speak from my own experience. When I used to work summer programs, and in the times that I didn't work summer programs, and I had the 2 months to sort of get right again, it would take until maybe May before I started to itch for some more time off, and for that opportunity again. When I worked the summer program, I found myself feeling that around Thanksgiving time, and because I think you just can only go so long before you really need a break, and a little bit of time off and time away from the daily routine and the grind to some extent. So
Well, I don't think we're going to get any additional listeners if we talk about how the educators are in need of the summer off.
well, I mean, this is tailored for educators, so I'm not expecting too many people from outside the world of education to be kind of avid followers of this podcast. But for those of you who are in the teaching profession, I definitely, where we're coming from, and that you have certainly deserved your time off.
Of course, of course. All right, so where would you like to begin today?
Well, just a couple of things. One of our listeners had emailed in and shared a Common Core documentary that's on YouTube. I'll put a link on the show notes, and it's about 30 minutes long. It's kind of interesting. Mostly touches upon the things that we sort of have discussed on this show, and things that many of us are familiar with. But it goes into following the money, a little bit of Diane Ravitch, a little bit of the Gates Foundation, and some of the people who are on the Common Core committee, the steering committee, and the Common Core creation. And so it's really all about the beginnings, and how this very, very quickly came to be, and all the people who have received or benefited from the Gates Foundation donations, and their economic support
Well,
in order to make the Common Core happen.
sorry, yeah. Well, I'll definitely check it out. But I will say I'm very eager to hear the dialogue about Common Core as the presidential debates begin, for both sides. Be very curious the direction that dialogue takes.
Well, if you had to put on your prognosticator glasses, how would you envision it unfolding?
This one I'm unfortunately more pessimistic on. I just don't think there's going to be an honest discussion about what's best for the product in the classroom. I think it's more going to be a discussion of big government
Right.
on one side and teachers unions on the other side, and
Right.
it's not going to be because I'm not totally convinced that these candidates are well versed in what Common Core is.
I am, and I am convinced that they're not.
So, but I definitely think it will be one of the key topics that's brought up in all the debates.
I would think it has to be. It's reached such a fever pitch in so many states. I know that we've discussed in the past few podcasts the attempts at repeal, in particular Michigan, and how they were fighting. And although they were not successful, I have a good feeling they'll continue to fight the good fight in trying to repeal it. I know locally on Long Island, some assemblymen and local politicians are trying to mitigate the damage of Common Core and APPR, and limiting the percentage that Common Core exams can actually count in the APPR, or the review, professional review of teachers and principals. So the fight still goes on, and it will be interesting to see how the candidates weigh in. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's going to be framed in the big government, small government, get your hands out of my pocket kind of approach, versus what's really good for kids. And unfortunately, and that will just
Yeah.
obscure the argument even further, and we'll be further along the road.
Yeah. Well, speaking of what's good for kids, is there any way we can convince the Supreme Court to make its decisions while we're still in class? Because this was quite a week.
It was an incredible week, and I had actually texted you the other day. It was just such a bizarre and wide-ranging news day, from terrorism to the funeral and funeral ceremonies in South Carolina, and of course the Supreme Court ruling on gay marriage. And there's just so much going on. And from a social studies perspective, and really hopefully any subject, but social studies in particular, it's just an unbelievable time to discuss everything that's going on in the world and in our country and internationally. So that really brings us to one of our topics today, which is the gay marriage ruling and how that impacts education. So, how do you think that this plays out and impacts education in our schools?
Well, I can only speak for obviously the school that I work in, but I'm sure that there's many kids throughout the country. We had an LGBT group form this year, and they were uh, pretty vocal about some of the key issues, and they tried to make a good presence in the school. And I know that the kids in charge of it were in my class this year, and they just were incredibly hopeful that the Supreme Court would rule in this favor. So I think it sends a nice message to young people who might be struggling with these issues, that that there is somebody on the side and the government on their side, to
Hmm.
because, as you heard throughout the day, just because of this victory doesn't mean that there are still not obstacles to overcome, and you can use the historical standpoint of Brown versus Board of Ed
Hmm.
to defend that. Just because the Supreme Court made a decision that segregation in schools was unconstitutional doesn't mean that every problem went away.
Well, I would go so far as to say you have an unbelievable amount of symbolism in the fact that in the same week that the Supreme Court says, or that the gay marriage is legal, that you have the fight to take down the Confederate flag in South Carolina, which was the remnants of, essentially 150 years ago in the South. So you're 100% right that even though change has happened legally, or change has happened governmentally, it doesn't mean that change has necessarily happened in the hearts and minds of individuals. And the Confederate flag is a perfect example and a perfect symbol of that in South Carolina, and in terms of racism towards African Americans. And then here you have the Supreme Court ruling. So this is a huge first step, but certainly if our history in this country is any indication, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Yeah, and the line was repeated over and over again that while now it's legal to be married in every state, you can still be fired from your job in over half of our states for being gay. You can be denied housing in over half of our states. So that's the point, that there's still, even legislatively, there's still work that needs to be done.
Right. Well, to continue with the historical parallels, so are we now going to enter the Jim Crow era of, in the gay marriage world, and what kind of efforts will be undertaken by those who are trying to circumvent the way of, the law of the land, and how I think a large number, certainly a growing number of individuals feel towards gay marriage. So, how are they going to try to turn the tide locally, and deny people the rights that the Supreme Court has already bestowed upon them?
But I think from a standpoint of a student, there are kids all over this country who are so incredibly encouraged by this one decision, that are struggling with their own sexuality. And as teachers, we don't know who those kids are.
Right.
So that's the part of this from the teacher standpoint that's just very uh, inspiring.
Right, I agree, and hopefully it takes some of the taboo away from homosexuality, and hopefully we can then go into exploring authors who are more openly gay and reading their work as opposed to, perhaps they were censored in some way, shape, or form. Uh, Certainly looking into anyone, historically, to look at the civil rights movement and the continuation of the civil rights movement in different areas. Certainly, gay marriage is a civil rights fight. So I think there's so much fertile ground to be explored in the classroom in so many different subject areas that I hope now people take advantage of it and really allow it to seep into curriculum and seep into classroom discussion and let it move forward. And you're right, if it could help those young people who are struggling with their own identity and their own sexuality, and if it can help them gain some confidence. It's hard enough for an adolescent to be confident in general, and then you add, the possibility of being stigmatized. It really hurts so many kids, and we've seen in the news, and we just from our own personal experiences, you see students who are disenchanted and in some cases inflict harm to themselves. In the most tragic cases, take their own lives because they're struggling with these issues. So if anything can kind of help that along, and I think this will go a long way, then it's certainly a wonderful thing.
And yes, and just the rapid pace with which this occurred. It's, the teacher in me is excited to be able to compare this movement to others in history. And I'm not
Hmm.
saying that the issues necessarily are the same, but just to see how the whole story unfolded. I mean, even our own president was against this when he first came into office,
That's right.
and that's not a very long time ago. And it really is remarkable.
Doesn't everything happen more quickly now? So the fact that this went from almost no issue to overturned in just a matter of a few years is really not surprising, because this is the pace that change occurs at in our time now. If that sentence
Well,
makes any
I'll
kind of
be
sense.
right. I'll be very whenever I teach the civil rights movement and I go over Loving versus Virginia, and you
Hmm.
tell the kids that it was illegal for black and white
Interracial
people
marriage, right?
to be married, and they're startled, they're shocked, and they can't believe that that was in the late 1960s.
Some of those laws are still in the books in those
Yeah.
counties.
My thought is, when will it be a time in class where you tell kids that same-sex couples couldn't get married, and they're startled like kids are today about the interracial marriage?
Uh,
No.
20 years, 30
Yeah,
years.
yeah.
It's pretty
or
crazy.
or less, or
Or
less.
less,
Yeah.
or less.
So,
Especially with the frequency with which people read the news nowadays, it could be even a lot less. Well, Nick, there were also a few other rulings, very important rulings that came down last week. One of them involved the Affordable Care Act. I know that you certainly have been following that closely. What are your thoughts about that?
well, I agreed with the decision, and I'm fascinated by Chief Justice John Roberts' position uh, on both of these rulings for healthcare. But my frustration is that when I hear people complain about the rulings and then they complain about the Affordable Care Act,
Hmm.
their criticisms are not about the legislation. Their criticisms are about problems we have in healthcare today that were in existence before the Affordable Care Act
Right.
or after. And I don't understand why people don't call them on that. Like, they will say things such as, you have to have multiple tests before you can get a procedure done. Well, that has nothing to do with the Affordable Care Act. We've had that issue with insurance before the Affordable Care Act.
Right. But once you have a scapegoat firmly in place, then people will just heap everything onto that and pile it all under one umbrella. Like, same thing with Common Core. Anything that ails public education now will be kind of thrown into the Common Core umbrella and vilified accordingly, because now you have an enemy that many people are very much opposed to. So I don't think it's much different in that regard.
Yeah, my disappointment, I guess, is just with the journalists that I hear questioning people, because I wish first of all, they always talk about replacing it, and I still don't know what their idea is to replace the Affordable Care Act with. I guess we'll hear that during the debates.
You definitely will not, because it's debates are all about talking points, and they will just continue to talk about repeal and change and get rid of and eradicate, and they'll use all those kinds of words, but they won't tell you necessarily what they're going to substitute it with. Just like people who are opposed to Common Core, but they won't tell you what should be done to fix education.
Right.
They'll just tell you that Common Core has to go, as if the magical solution will just take Common Core's place as soon as Common Core is gotten rid of. And that's a fallacy. And the same is true with the Affordable Care Act
Yeah.
or any other major problem that faces us in terms of domestic policy.
I'll sum it up with the fact that I, like most people, have frustrations with our healthcare system, no doubt about it. But when you're allowed to keep your children on the plan until they're 26,
Mhm.
when you are providing more people with coverage, to me, those are good moments of progress. So I don't know why we would want to do away with that because we have problems that are not necessarily related to this bill.
So like everything else, it will evolve, and hopefully we'll get to a better version of what that could be and should be over time. The problem is how soon will that be, and how much wasted money and wasted energy and wasted resources will occur and be used up until that point.
Right. Okay. Well, let's not, I won't make this a healthcare podcast. So,
So I know there was an article that you had come across, just jumping back into education. I believe it was in the New York Post regarding the allegation that some regents' grades were changed. Could you summarize that for us a little bit?
yeah. And then the front page of the Sunday New York Post, there was an article about automotive high school. Now, a few months ago, there was an article about a new hiree in the New York City Department of Education, and her name was is Amy Horowitz. Now they described her as a change agent, that she's somebody who comes in and turns around failing schools.
She's like
This
the wolf from Pulp Fiction.
right. So this school, apparently Automotive High School, is struggling to get kids to graduate and perform well on exams. And then the article claims that, again, we have to be fair. These are allegations
Mhm.
that some grades were changed. And what is interesting is not all of the grades were necessarily changed to increase the student scores. A couple were actually changed to decrease, but several 63s, 64s became passing grades. Now, there's actually even a quote from a parent who was a little bit upset about this, thinking that she'd rather her child be held to the right standards. But I don't know what your thoughts are, if you think this is something that's a little bit more prominent than people are led to believe.
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, I will state that I know Amy Horowitz, and I actually worked for Amy Horowitz back when I worked in Brooklyn. So, I don't know if this is something that happened or didn't happen. It's certainly in the allegation stage. So, without going too far into that, it does raise an interesting point, because there is a clause in the administrator's manual that says that if you find an error in the scoring, that you are responsible to fix it, and that is not considered scrubbing. Now, scrubbing traditionally, and this has been a long, long, long standing thing that's gone on probably since the beginning of Regents, where you look over an exam that is close, 62, 63, 64, or it could even be an 82 and 83 and 84 if we're talking about mastery levels. And the idea was with scrubbing that you go back to revisit the paper to see if there were any errors made. Now, of course, there are two different approaches. There are the people who do it the correct way, and they're looking to see if there truly were any errors, because that could be the difference between passing and failing. And if that differential is due to a teacher's error, then a student rightfully deserves to have his paper or her paper changed to reflect the work that he or she did. However, what scrubbing typically became was, let's change all 62, 63s, and 64s into 65s. And that, of course, does not accurately reflect or honestly reflect student performance. And now that teacher performance is tied to student performance, it becomes that much more convoluted. So what's this brings us back to the article, and what's interesting about the allegations here is is this an example of scrubbing, or is this an example of going back and honestly and earnestly trying to provide students with the points that they deserved, but through teacher error they did not receive? And the fact that grades were changed in both directions could possibly point to the fact that this was an honest, going back and correcting honest mistakes. It could also, if you want to be cynical, could be looked at as a smokescreen to try to get kids to pass. Because, in all honesty, what's the difference if a student has a 79 or a 77 or a 61 or a 58? It doesn't really change much. So perhaps if you show grades going in both directions, it takes away from people looking where they, in all honesty, should be looking, that this is an example of scrubbing. I don't know what happened in this particular situation, but it certainly raises an interesting point.
Right. Well, I would have thought that that practice, whatever, has been eliminated with the way we send our papers now to an outside agency to grade them. Isn't it all scanned in and the grade is just appears on the computer?
It is, however, if you do find an error, you can have it.
You can still go back.
You
Okay.
can go back and scan it as you should, because sometimes there's a mistake, and um, again, there's human error. Sometimes there's a bubble that someone forgets to fill in, or someone has misgraded a paper. That certainly happens. We try our best using the rubrics that are available
Right.
and using the training period. But even so, when you're 250 papers in and it's the end of the third day of grading, and sometimes mistakes get made, and people are human. So we have
Right.
to have a method to be able to
Okay.
get back.
Well, I'm sure all of the Post readers focused on that part of the article, yet
Hmm.
there was something later in the article that really got me upset. And it's the statistics for their living environment exam. Now, this is again according to the Post. The Post
Hmm.
says that 66 students were signed up, enrolled to take the living environment regents exam. Of those 66 students, first of all, 30 didn't even show up for the test. So
And
30
they
kids.
all passed.
No.
That's scrubbing. It has to be.
Okay. So 30 kids don't show up. Your sarcasm is going to definitely ruin my point on this one.
It pretty much ruins everything, but that's
So now
besides the
you
point.
have 36 kids out of 66 taking it. Out of the 36, 4 of them passed the exam. And here's what they then go on to say. And again, I don't know where this is coming from, but the Post is claiming
Mhm.
that last year they got rid of a living environment teacher. And the way the Post describes it is a highly successful living environment teacher. Now, I have no idea what they mean by highly successful. My point in bringing this up is if we are going to continue to have to fight to get rid of teachers based on test scores when there are schools where kids are not even showing up for the exam, we are never going to make the progress that needs to be made. And our problems in education, first of all, are so diverse. The
Mhm.
problems that exist in, the rich sections of Connecticut are so different than the problems that exist at Automotive High School. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not judging anybody, but this is not going to work. If you have 30 kids who aren't even showing up to take the exam,
Right.
do we really think the problem is what the teacher was doing for the last 10 months in the classroom, or are the problems far beyond that?
And what were the attendance rates before Regents Day?
Right. Also, you're absolutely right. These pro and I'm not sit my anger, and I really was angry when I read that paragraph. My anger is that if we took our resources that we've been using just to think of all the supplies we've had to buy just to do all these tests
Mhm. Mhm.
and hired some social workers to help these young people,
Right.
you'd get more kids performing well in the exams. But these leaders, they just don't get it. And I don't know if Amy Horowitz gets it. I mean, I know you speak highly of her. I don't know if they understand that this
Well,
is not the way to approach these problems.
I only say I wanna give her the benefit of the doubt only because I do know her or did know her at one point. But, you're 100% right. And listen, the misallocation of resources is at the heart of so many problems. You talked about healthcare before. Holy cow. I mean, if we could reallocate resources properly, imagine what kind of inroads you can make in providing better healthcare for everybody. And the same is true for education. If you could reallocate resources wisely, then you can make a difference, a much greater difference than you can by increasing the level of testing and the
Right.
frequency of testing.
And I don't want to make this statement that all schools don't have problems. They do, but everybody's
Absolutely.
problems are different. And what the government has done on a state level and the federal level is they've just mandated all this testing, which has only taken away our time and resources to help the kids that need help. And that's my frustration.
That's right.
And the fact that based on these statistics, teachers would be losing their jobs. And I don't understand how I will blame teachers when they need to be blamed. I don't know how it's a teacher's fault if the student doesn't show up for the test.
It isn't. That's the bottom line. It isn't. But when they put in APPR and they moved and to some degree connected Common Core to APPR, they changed the focus and they put it onto teachers. And when you take the focus away from students, it's to their detriment. And this is one of the major sins is that it shifted focus to the teachers. And now they're looking at statistics not just from the perspective of how are kids doing, but they're looking at statistics from the perspective of, oh my God, this is going to hurt my APPR score. And now all of a sudden we're looking at the wrong thing. And we're trying to serve two masters instead of one. As long as we're going to distract ourselves with all of this nonsense, then we're never going to make the necessary inroads that we have to, and never really get to the level of make the strides that we have to make in order to make things better. It's supposed to be summertime. We're supposed to be relaxed and happy. So much for that.
Okay, I'll try now. Well, then tell me about the movie you saw this summer.
Okay, well, I saw Inside Out, which is the new Pixar movie, and I love this movie. I know you didn't get a chance to see it yet. I don't want to give away too much, but the geniuses at Pixar in this particular case, it's Pete Docter who he made Up. He wrote and directed Up, and I believe Monsters Inc. If I'm not mistaken. I think he was a writer on Toy Story, one of the Toy Story movies. But what he did, and the other writers and geniuses at Pixar did with this film was they essentially recreate or get into the mind of a pre-adolescent girl. I think she's 11 in the film, and it essentially starts with her birth and joy, how she experiences joy. And right off the bat, Joy, there's a button and Joy pushes the button that controls the brain center and the baby kind of smiles. And then as soon as the baby smiles, the next thing that happens is the baby cries and we go back into the brain and we find out that that's sadness pushing the button. And now of course the relationship between joy and sadness is part of what's going on in the experience. And for the childhood and until the pre-adolescent period, joy rules the day, but then the child goes through and starts to experience pre-adolescence. And that's when sadness starts to enter the picture more and more and changes and shapes the way that all of the memories have been viewed by the child. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I don't know how any child possibly understands that movie. They can get it, in terms of the color and the jokes, and there was some physical humor and so on. But that movie is so smart. I can't imagine that there won't be a single college campus come the fall or the spring where psychology class where they will not be studying that movie in some way, shape, or form. It is just absolutely genius and brilliantly done. And having not only a daughter who has gone through pre-adolescence in my own life, but also and my son, of course, just starting, but working with students at this age, it is so dead on. And I just thought it would be something worth talking about because we both work in 7 through 12. And there's a different way that you approach and that you teach a seventh grader or an eighth grader than you do a 10th or 11th or 12th grader. And I thought it'd be interesting to just discuss that because that's really at the heart of what this movie is about. But essentially, it's when sadness enters the picture and becomes a more prominent or plays a more prominent role in the psyche and the mindset of the young person, and how do you navigate that as a teacher? How do you navigate that as a mentor? How do you navigate that as a parent? I just thought it was so fascinating how they touched upon that and brought that to bear and brought that to light in the film. But so what do you how do you view the differences in how we deal with or teach the younger kids, the six, seven, and eights, the middle school kids versus the high school kids?
For me, the answer is one word: patience. When I go from a seventh grade class to an 11th grade class and then back to a seventh grade class, uh, you just have to be patient with the younger kids. They're full of a lot of energy, enthusiasm, which is all great. Now, I'm not going to change my approach to my lessons, but you just have to be patient with how they, behave and act in the classroom. Their enthusiasm and excitement should not be misinterpreted as being, poorly behaved. And I think sometimes teachers might fall into that little bit of a trap.
The other thing that we deal with is it at the six, seven, and eight level. There's a huge disparity in where they are developmentally. The student who was born later in the year, there is a maturity difference. We can see it more notably. When they're 11th graders, 12th graders, it doesn't matter if they were born in October or they were born in January. You really almost don't see it. It's sort of negligible at that point. But in the younger grades, it's very prominent. And also, they're at such different levels, and you could just tell some kids are 6 feet tall and some kids are 4 feet tall in a seventh grade class, whereas there's a leveling out as they get older. So right off the bat, you could just see physically the differences between, in maturation and development and in height and growth. And you have to, it's much, I think it makes it more complicated to effectively work with the middle school student, just for those very reasons, because they're literally all over the map. Whereas on the older level, in the older grades, it's a little bit more predictable as to where they are. There's still some variation and some uh, differences, but they're definitely closer together. They kind of pull closer together as opposed to how wildly different they are in the middle school years.
I completely agree. I just your approach just has to be different. They're totally different young people.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
But it's a great movie, and I
Oh, I'll
really hope you
definitely
get
get
a
a chance to
chance
see it.
to
Yeah, I will.
take a look. And if you haven't seen it, definitely see it out there. And don't bother with the 3D. I saw it in 3D, and there's really, unless you just feel like making an additional donation to Disney and Pixar, there's really no need to save the 3D money for the Jurassic World. I think that's more
Oh,
worth it.
okay.
But anyway, thank you very much for another interesting podcast, Nick. If you'd like to reach us on the web, you can find us at stateofedpodcast.com if you want to ask a question or suggest a topic or send us something that we should take a look at, like our one listener did last week. Please feel free to do that at ask@stateofedpodcast.com. You could also find us on the iTunes store or in the iTunes store. You can go to the podcast section, search for State of Ed Podcast, and please subscribe to us. You'll be able to get all of the back episodes. This is episode number 9. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, it's at SOE Podcast. And that is our show for the week. So thank you very much, Nick.
It's the same to you. Enjoy your day and your week, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot. Take care.